So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint watercolor sushi and also a trick I use to quickly and easily paint rice. This is definitely a painting subject that relies heavily on texture, so I think the Backrun paper texture is pretty important if you like this kind of look. For the brushes, I'm just using the ones in the regular watercolor kit. And I'm going to start by painting this one here on the left. And for that, I'm going to use the abstract round brush, and I'm going to paint the sashimi on top first, and I'm going to try to do it in one long stroke. So I'm pressing hard to make the brush kind of wider, and then I'm lightening it up to kind of taper it off. After that, I'm going to follow some of these striations here with just another layer of brush strokes. Now I want each of these kind of stripes here to fade off on the right side. So to do that, I'm going to change to the water blender brush, and maybe around 10 or 15%, and I'm just going to blend that one side. Next, I'm going to change to a very light version of that same orange, same abstract round that we used before, but this time at a really small size, and I'm just going to go in there and add a couple of light lines, just like this. And to finish it up, I can grab the eraser brush and just cut this back to match our sketch a little bit more closely. Now when it comes to painting sushi, I think it's a good idea to always do the rice last, and that's because it doesn't have a lot of detail and it's easier to kind of judge whether it's good or not if it has some context. So for the rice, I'm going to make it on its own layer, a new layer there, but I'm going to drag it below our little piece of salmon. For the color, just so it's visible, I'm going to use a kind of medium, warm gray tone like that. And for the brush, I'm going to switch over to the hard edge brush. And at a medium size, maybe a kind of a large medium size, I'm just going to go in there and do a bunch of abstract dabs and lines and dots, just like this. And I think the sketch can be a little bit distracting at this point, especially when it comes to painting rice. So I'm just going to turn it off for a minute here. Now using the same brush and the same color we did all this with, I'm just going to add some kind of line detail just along the perimeter of where the rice would be. There we go. And now within the interior here, I'm going to do a couple of rice kind of oval shapes. And next I can lighten it to make it look more white. And this is the reason I did the rice here on its own layer. So make sure that layer is selected by itself. Then you can go to the adjustments, go to the curves, and then this little blue circle down here, this blue dot, just tap it and raise it up. And raise it up pretty light, not quite until it disappears, but I think around this range looks pretty good. There we go. And sometimes it ends up being a little bit so light that it's sort of disappearing onto the white background. So to fix that, I like to use the selection tool set to freehand, and I just select the very edge of the rice, circle back, I'll feather it out a little bit, and I'll just darken it using the brightness slider. And that's usually enough to give us a little bit more contrast. And another thing you can do to increase the contrast with the background is by adding a little bit of a shadow on the background, and that's pretty easy. I'm going to do that on its own layer above the rice. And I'll use a cold gray tone, something like that. I'll use the abstract round brush, and maybe around 30 or 40%, I'll just go in there and just rough this out. And I'm kind of covering up the rice in a couple areas, so I'm going to use the eraser to cut it back so it sort of more closely follows the edge of the rice. And to lighten the shadow, I'm going to do just like what I did before with the curves adjustment. And I'll just raise that bottom node until the shadow is just barely visible. There we go. Then I can use the selection tool set to freehand, and I'll just select the top edge of the shadow, the one that's closest to the rice. I'll feather that out, and I'll darken it. And that's another way to kind of get a little more contrast. This one looks a little bit too dark, so I think I'll just lower the opacity to make the shadow even more subtle. And once this first sushi is all done here, I'm just going to merge those layers onto one, just to keep it more organized. Then I can turn the sketch back on and make a new layer where we can move on and do this second sushi, which is a little more challenging than the first one. So just like before, I'm going to do the toppings and the filling first. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the abstract round brush. And since the inside of this one has some salmon and stuff, I think I'll fill it out in a very light pink tone first. And after that, I'm just going to switch the color a few times using the same abstract round and just fill in all of these different elements here. And this area here is supposed to be the fish roe, the flying fish roe. And to do that, first I'll use kind of an orange salmon-y color. Same abstract round brush. And I'm just going to dot it around all over this just to create that kind of texture. Then I'm going to go over it a few more times in a couple of different darker and lighter shades of this color, just to give it some depth. And I usually like to make sure there's a few super dark ones in there as well. And then I'll change to pure white, very small size on this abstract round. And I'll do a bunch of these kind of C shapes to be like reflections. And I think while I have this white selected, I'll add some detail to my salmon here. And for this larger fish roe on top, I'm going to do the same technique I did down here, just at a slightly larger scale. And I think these ones should be a little bit more yellow. So I'm just going to select them with the freehand selection tool and then shift the hue. Now this sushi is coated in black and white sesame seeds. So for that, I'm going to change my brush to the fine liner pen and just dot the edges of this, just in a very dark bluish tone and a light yellowish tone. And because the rice has a little bit of an issue with contrast with the white background, I tried to focus a lot of seeds along the edge here, just to give me as much help as possible to kind of define that boundary. And at this point, with the details done, I can move on and paint the rice. So that's going to be on its own new layer, and I'm going to drag it so it's beneath all the toppings and details. Again, I'll select a medium warm gray tone and the hard edge brush. And I'll just randomly kind of dot and dash this around. And just like before, I'm going to switch off the sketch while I add these details. And I'm just going to go along the edge, especially these kind of three-dimensional edges, and add the line details there as well. And of course, to make this look more like rice, I'm going to again go to the curves adjustment and raise this up just until it looks light enough. Now, just like before I kind of darkened the edge of it, I think this one needs it as well, but it's also a little bit more complicated because this is like a cube. So for that, I'm going to use the freehand selection tool, and I'm going to select this side because I think that'll be the darkest side. I'll go along the edge and then circle back. I'm going to avoid defining anything on the top because that should be getting the most light and having the least shadows. So I'll feather out this selection just a little bit, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll darken it just a tiny bit. And to finish this one up, I'm going to add a shadow on the bottom just like I did with the previous sushi. Now I almost forgot, but this is one of those kind of inside out sushis. So it does have a thin layer of the seaweed inside. So for that, I'm going to choose a pretty dark bluish green tone. Then I'm going to use the hard edge brush. And I'm just going to quickly kind of sketch that out. And next here, I'm going to move on and do the last sushi. And of course, I'm going to start by doing all the details here in the filling using the abstract round brush. And the seaweed on the side is pretty simple. Again, I'll select a pretty dark bluish green tone. And I like to use the abstract round at a large size. and do some pretty big, bold, overlapping strokes. And I could blend this together to make it smoother, but I really like this rough kind of abstract look. Now I'm going to use the eraser and just cut this back to match the sketch a little bit better. Now the seaweed of course wraps around, so it makes sense that we see a little bit of an outline along the edge there. But for that, I prefer to use the hard edge brush, and I'll just carefully kind of outline that in. And after that, I'll make a new layer, put it below the toppings, and I'll quickly fill out the rice. And to finish it up, I'll put the shadow on the bottom. And there we go. These 3 cute little sushis are all done. And here's a look at how I kind of envision the final result. And maybe it's just me, but painting sushi makes me hungry for sushi. So that pretty much wraps this up. If you think I've earned it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks again for all your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.